The night sea of the Bungo Strait was black glass, smooth as oil under the dim crescent moon. The Imperial Japanese Navy submarine 168 drifted in silence, its diesels dead, its batteries quietly driving the screws at barely 2 knots. Inside the narrow steel hull, men whispered, breathed, sweated. The air was heavy with oil and metal and nerves. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Tanaka stood at the periscope, his hands damp against the cold bronze grips, eyes fixed on the horizon. He was not watching for ships, he was listening. Through the hydrophone room, a faint, rhythmic sound echoed, not the chaotic wash of propellers or the hiss of distant cavitation, but something mechanical, deliberate, pulsing through the sea at perfect intervals. Ping, pause, ping, pause. A tone so even that it cut through the usual underwater confusion. Tanaka frowned. He had heard of this sound in briefings, dismissed it as rumor, a curiosity from British convoys in the Atlantic. Now it was here, reaching, into what every Japanese submariner had been taught was safe water, their own coastal approaches, their own defensive zone. "Sonar," whispered his sound operator, Chief Petty Officer Ito, barely breathing the word. In Japanese, the men still called it supersonic echo ranging, an idea so new it didn't yet have a proper name. The ping was not a natural sound. It was an American sound, a sound of science turned into a weapon. Outside, beyond the strait's dark mouth, American destroyers were sweeping with an eerie rhythm, their transmitters throwing cones of sound that struck the submarine's hull and came back again, transformed into information. For the first time in the Pacific War, the hunters could see with sound. Tanaka felt his stomach tighten. The Americans were not supposed to be here. The official naval bulletins had declared their Pacific Fleet crippled at Pearl Harbor. The I-boat fleet, long-ranged, proud, and quiet, had been told they owned these seas. But that ping, steady and mechanical, denied it. It said that the enemy was learning faster than Japan imagined. He lowered the periscope, his face pale in the red light. "All compartments," he said quietly. "Rig for deep." The diving alarm wailed through the steel hull, and the boat angled down, bow planes cutting the water. As I-168 slipped below 100 feet, the ping followed. At 150, it was fainter but still there. At 200, it vanished, or seemed to. Tanaka exhaled, but his operator shook his head. "Still there, sir. Different bearing. They are correcting." Tanaka froze. Correcting? That meant the enemy was not just hearing them, but tracking them, using the echoes to estimate range, bearing, even depth. It was impossible. Japan's doctrine taught that below 200 feet, sound bent and refracted through cold layers, masking a submarine from any surface detection. The enemy had either learned to compensate for those layers or built equipment powerful enough to cut through them. Above them, the destroyers began their run. The first distant thumps came through the hull like the heartbeat of the sea. Depth charges, crude, heavy, mechanical drums filled with high explosive, timed to detonate at preset depths. The I-168 had survived them before, in the Aleutians, when American escorts dropped charges by guesswork. Then, the bombs had fallen far behind, exploding harmlessly in confusion. But now, the pattern was precise, 3 detonations above, 2 to port, 1 directly aft, each closer than the last. Inside the boat, the lights flickered. The pressure hull rang like a bell. Men clutched pipes and prayed. "They know where we are," Ito said, voice trembling. "They are walking us down." "Impossible," Tanaka said, but his tone betrayed doubt. He ordered a sharp turn to starboard, deeper, 250 feet, then 280. The depth gauge needle quivered. The hull creaked, groaned. The ping faded, then returned, exactly aligned with the new bearing. For the first time, Tanaka felt something worse than fear, helplessness. He realized he was fighting an enemy who had rewritten the rules. Only later, after the war, would American records reveal what had happened that night. The destroyer, USS Radford, operating with a newly installed QC series echo ranging set, had made one of the earliest sonar contacts in the Western Pacific. The system emitted a pulse of sound between 20 and 30 kilocycles per second, recorded the echo on an oscilloscope, and gave operators a readout of range and bearing accurate to within 50 yards. To the Americans, it was just another patrol. To Tanaka, it was revelation. The Americans had turned sound itself into a weapon. When the last depth charge exploded and the destroyers turned away, I-168 limped towards safety, battered but alive. The crew lay in the dim light, too exhausted to speak. Tanaka sat at the plotting table, head in, his hands, listening to the fading echoes through the hydrophone, the heartbeat of a new kind of war. He understood what it meant before anyone in Tokyo did. The Americans had learned to see under the sea. In the days that followed, Tanaka filed a detailed report to the 6th Fleet headquarters at Truk Lagoon, warning that the enemy's sound detection had grown dangerously accurate. His superiors noted the report politely, stamped it for further study, and shelved it. The Imperial Navy, still confident in its long-range submarines and doctrine of stealth, could not believe that the Americans, a nation of mechanics, as one admiral sneered, had outpaced them in the invisible battlefield of acoustics. Yet the Americans had done just that. The sonar sets that now swept the Pacific were the direct descendants of British ASDIC technology, refined in American laboratories at San Diego and Harvard. The Bureau of Ships had pushed production to industrial scale, installing thousands of sets on every destroyer, escort, and even merchant vessel. Each new class improved on the last, from the early QB model to the QC, and finally the QHB, whose twin-beam transmitter allowed continuous tracking even during a depth charge run. To the men who sailed with them, they were miracles of metal and math. To the men who fled from them, they were the sound of doom. By dawn, I-168 surfaced in mist. The crew climbed up, gasping for air. Behind them, the sea was calm again, no sign of the invisible hunt. The commander stood on the conning tower, looking east toward the Pacific. He thought of the distant battle reports of American carriers returning to the sea after Pearl Harbor, of long-range patrols striking across thousands of miles. He had dismissed them as propaganda. Now, listening to the memory of that rhythmic ping still echoing in his mind, he knew better. The Americans had found a way to make the ocean speak, and once the ocean spoke for them, nowhere would be safe. The war under the sea had just begun, and Japan was already behind. Before the Pacific roared into total war, before the echoes of sonar pings rolled across the dark waters of the Bungo Strait, the United States Navy had already begun listening to the sea in earnest. The roots of the sound weapon reached back to the quiet laboratories of the 1930s, when scientists, mathematicians, and a handful of forward-thinking officers understood that the future of submarine warfare would belong to whoever could hear first. In 1931, at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, engineers working with borrowed British data began experimenting with supersonic echo ranging, the process of sending a pulse of sound into water and measuring its reflection. The British called it ASDIC, after the Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee that had created it during the Great War. The Americans adopted the method, but improved its precision, replacing fragile piezoelectric crystals with rugged magnetostrictive transducers capable of surviving the vibration of destroyer hulls and the salt of the Pacific. By the outbreak of war in December 1941, nearly every new American destroyer carried an echo-ranging set, the QC, or its improved cousin, the QB. But sonar was still in its infancy. Its language was primitive, its use limited. Operators could hear echoes but not always interpret them. A whale might sound like a submarine, a thermal layer might mask a target entirely. It was not yet the sharp weapon it would become. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy was rich in equipment but poor in doctrine. Submarine hunting remained largely an art of patience and luck. Destroyers swept areas by guesswork, dropping depth charges on uncertain bearings. The sonar sets could detect a contact at 1,000 yards, sometimes 2,000 in ideal conditions, but every explosion deafened the sensors for precious seconds. Many commanders still preferred the old hydrophone, which at least could listen while silent. Across the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy began the war with a different faith. Their submarines were long-range predators, designed to strike at capital ships. They believed themselves invisible, protected by deep water and by an enemy's ignorance. In the first months of the war, they were right. Japanese I-boats prowled the Indian Ocean and the Australian coast, sinking merchantmen, even attacking American carriers. The Americans, reeling from disaster, seemed slow and clumsy. Then came the slow turn, invisible at first, but decisive. In January 1942, the Navy Bureau of Ships established the Sound Division at its headquarters in Washington. Its mission was simple: make sonar work. It gathered scientists from Bell Laboratories, Harvard's Underwater Sound Laboratory, and the University of California. Men like Dr. Harvey Hayes and Dr. Floyd Gale turned mathematics into machinery. Within months, the first improvements appeared in the field: stronger transmitters, narrower beams, and training programs that taught sonar operators to read echoes as fluently as language. A destroyer's sonar room became a new kind of battlefield. In the dim light of its control console, young sailors learned to interpret tone and rhythm, to separate true contacts from false ones. They learned to track a submarine's motion by tiny changes in echo time to convert sound delay into range and Doppler shift into speed. To them, the ocean became an acoustic landscape of whispers and ghosts. By the middle of 1942, while Japanese engineers still debated whether active echo ranging was even practical, American destroyers were conducting coordinated attacks using sonar bearings. The new doctrine called it holding contact. Instead of dropping a single pattern of depth charges and running away, ships now stayed above the echo, attacking in waves. One destroyer held the sonar contact while another dropped its pattern. It was dangerous, requiring perfect coordination and nerves of steel, but it worked. The first proof came not in the Atlantic, but in the dark waters around Guadalcanal. On September 9, 1942, the destroyer USS O'Brien detected a submerged contact off Savo Island. The sonar operator, Seaman First Class Joseph Campanella, kept the echo locked as the ship maneuvered. Target steady at 1,000 yards, bearing green 0 to 8, he reported, voice shaking. The depth charges fell in perfect sequence. The sea erupted. When the bubbles cleared, oil and wreckage floated to the surface. It was I-19, one of Japan's most aggressive submarines. The Americans had made their first kill by sound alone. From that moment, the learning curve steepened. The Navy created dedicated anti-submarine schools in Key West, Miami, and San Diego. Each graduating class produced hundreds of operators who could distinguish a submarine echo from the hum of a propeller or the churn of surf. They drilled on simulators, practiced in swimming pools, memorized the shape of waveforms. Sonar, once a mystery, became an exact discipline. At the same time, industry responded with a speed that stunned both allies and enemies. Western Electric produced transducers by the thousands. General Electric built amplifiers so sensitive they could hear the heartbeat of a destroyer's own hull. The new QHB sonar set, entering service in 1943, could track a submerged submarine continuously, even while the destroyer maneuvered to attack. The dead interval, once a hunter's blind moment, was gone. Japan never matched this momentum. Its engineers built hydrophones, not sonars, and relied on passive listening, a doctrine inherited from the First World War. The idea was to hide in silence and hear the enemy first. But silence is only safety when the enemy is deaf. By 1943, the Americans were no longer deaf. At Truk, in the command rooms of the Sixth Fleet, Japanese officers debated reports from returning captains. They spoke of American destroyers that seemed to know exactly where to drop their charges, even at night, even through squalls. The explanations grew desperate. Perhaps aircraft were guiding them. Perhaps magic radar waves penetrated the sea. None guessed the truth. It was mathematics, pure and merciless. For every Japanese submarine lost, American analysts examined the engagement data bearing, echo strength, time to contact, depth settings, and adjusted tactics accordingly. Each kill became an experiment. Each success refined the next. War had become laboratory. By the end of 1942, sonar had transformed from an instrument into a doctrine. The destroyers no longer waited for submarines to attack convoys. They hunted them. The ocean that had once concealed Japan's undersea fleet was becoming transparent. From Pearl Harbor to Midway, Japan had believed that stealth was power. From Bungo Strait onward, the Americans proved that sound was stronger. And somewhere deep beneath that knowledge, beneath the cold pulse of the echo and the hum of machinery, a new kind of warfare was being born, one where victory would be measured not by what the eye could see, but by what the ear could find. By the dawn of 1943, the sea war in the Pacific was changing tone, literally. What had begun as a struggle of torpedoes and chance encounters was now becoming a symphony of sound. The United States Navy had learned that the ocean itself could be mapped, not by light or chart, but by pulse and echo. The Imperial Japanese Navy, slow to accept this truth, would pay for that delay in steel and blood. At the start of the new year, the American destroyer force in the South Pacific numbered fewer than 100 ships. But every month brought new arrivals lean, hard-edged Fletchers, bristling with radar antennas and carrying the newest QHB sonar. Each carried a trained team of sound operators drilled to perfection. Their job was simple: find, hold, and kill. Until then, American anti-submarine warfare had been reactive, protecting convoys, chasing torpedo wakes, striking back only after damage had been done. In 1943, that changed. The Navy's fleet training publication, number 136, issued from Pearl Harbor in February, rewrote the rulebook. It ordered destroyers to act aggressively, to use sonar offensively, to hunt independently when no convoys were present. It was a revolution in thinking. The idea came from the Atlantic, where the Royal Navy's hunter-killer groups had begun turning the tide against the German U-boats. But the Americans added something new: scale. They paired destroyers with long-range patrol aircraft and escort carriers, linking sonar, radar, and radio direction finding into one continuous net. Sound in the water joined sight in the air. No submarine could slip through both. In March, the destroyer USS Strong demonstrated what the new doctrine meant. Operating off New Georgia, she detected a submerged contact at 2,000 yards. Rather than attack immediately, her captain, Commander Joseph Wellings, ordered a slow, deliberate approach, maintaining sonar contact while maneuvering into the ideal firing position. At 600 yards, Strong released a precise diamond pattern of depth charges, each set to detonate at different depths. The first explosions missed. The second pattern did not. Oil, debris, and the unmistakable scent of diesel rose through the froth. Post-war records confirmed the victim, I-157, lost with all hands. The Japanese command was baffled. How could the Americans locate a submerged boat so quickly and strike with such precision? The answer lay not only in better equipment, but in better thinking. The United States Navy had realized that sonar was not just a defensive tool, but an offensive sensor, a weapon as decisive as a torpedo. At the same time, new depth charge technology turned that weapon into execution. The Mark 9 depth charge, introduced in mid-1943, could be set to explode at depths beyond 600 feet, far below the reach of the old Mark 6, which maxed out at 300. Its firing mechanism, improved with hydrostatic pistons rather than fragile bellows, allowed precise timing even under heavy pressure. American destroyers now carried over 70 charges apiece, allowing them to maintain attacks for hours. The Japanese, by contrast, were trapped in their own doctrine. Their submarines were designed to fight on the surface fast, long-legged, and armed with powerful torpedoes meant for capital ships. The Imperial Navy still saw the submarine as a samurai's blade, striking at battleships, not freighters. Anti-submarine warfare was beneath them a defensive art, unglamorous, unsung. Few Japanese officers even understood how sonar worked. When the first detailed reports of American echo ranging reached Tokyo in early 1943, they were met with skepticism. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, wrote in a margin note, "Impossible sound cannot travel so clearly in the open ocean." The Imperial Navy Technical Bureau requested further study. By the time that study began, a dozen Japanese submarines had vanished without trace. The Americans were learning faster than Japan could react. Every engagement became a classroom. The Sound School at Key West analyzed after-action reports, identifying patterns in operator performance, the rate of echo loss during turns, the optimal interval between charge drops, the effects of sea temperature on signal strength. Data that the Japanese dismissed as trivial became the foundation of an entire science. In April, Admiral William Halsey authorized the first dedicated killer group in the Pacific, a task force centered on the escort carrier USS Bogue and her screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts. Equipped with sonar, radar, and radio intercept gear, they patrolled known submarine lanes. The method was brutally efficient. The carrier's aircraft scouted ahead, forcing Japanese boats to dive. Once submerged, the sonar teams took over. The pings began, the patterns closed, and within minutes the ocean erupted. The results were devastating. Between April and September 1943, 11 Japanese submarines were destroyed in the Central and South Pacific more than in the entire previous year. The Imperial Navy's once proud undersea arm began to vanish from its own waters. To the men aboard those doomed boats, the experience was incomprehensible. Surviving Japanese officers, interrogated after the war, described the same nightmare. "We could hear them calling," said Lieutenant Commander Sakai Yamashita, former captain of I-34, "a metal sound, ping, 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 like a hammer in the dark. Then the explosions, always closer. We dove deep, but the sound followed. There was no hiding. This was more than weaponry, it was psychology. American crews, trained to trust their machines, grew confident. Japanese crews, trained to trust silence, grew afraid. The deeper they went, the louder the echoes became. By autumn, U.S. destroyer flotillas operated like surgical instruments. A sonar contact would be classified, plotted, attacked, and confirmed in under 15 minutes. Commanders began describing their operations not as hunts, but as sweeps. What had once been chance was now method. Even the mathematics of war had changed. Naval intelligence began compiling kill probabilities, statistical estimates of how many depth charges were needed to achieve a given chance of destruction at a known depth. By the end of 1943, the probability of killing a submerged submarine with one coordinated attack had risen from 10% to over 50%. The Imperial Japanese Navy could not adapt. Their response, deeper diving, slower speeds, and longer patrols, only made them easier targets. The ocean that once protected them had turned against them, a vast amplifier of American sound. In Tokyo, the staff of the Sixth Fleet began to whisper of a Kaite Jigoku, a hell under the sea. They were not wrong. By the close of 1943, the doctrine of American anti-submarine warfare had completed its metamorphosis. It was no longer defense, it was predation. The United States had turned sonar into strategy, and strategy into industry. Every ping that echoed through the Pacific marked not just a target found, but a nation learning how to hunt in total darkness and how to win. By early 1944, the Pacific Ocean itself had become a map of sound. Each convoy route, each island approach, each strait and channel was charted not only by depth and current, but by the invisible patterns of echo and return. To the United States Navy, the sea was no longer dark, it was measurable. At Pearl Harbor, in a nondescript concrete building near Makalapa Hill, a small group of naval officers and scientists gathered each morning before dawn. Their mission was unprecedented, to turn sonar into numbers. Commander Ralph Potter of the Bureau of Ships called it acoustic arithmetic. He believed that if you could record every ping, every depth charge, every confirmed sinking, you could reduce the chaos of underwater war to a solvable equation. They did not operate in isolation. From Key West, San Diego, and Guam, radio messages poured in after action reports, hydrographic readings, water temperatures, echo strengths, and attack results. These were plotted on enormous wall charts, showing the Pacific as a grid of probabilities. Red dots marked confirmed kills, blue lines showed temperature layers, the thermoclines, that bent sound like glass. It was a fusion of oceanography, mathematics, and warfare. The Japanese still saw the sea as spirit and fate. The Americans were beginning to see it as data. By February, that data was changing tactics. Destroyer captains were briefed not just on enemy positions but on the day's acoustic forecast, the predicted range at which sonar would function based on salinity, temperature, and sea state. They called it the sound weather. If the ocean grew too warm near the surface, sonar beams would refract downward, leaving a shadow zone where submarines could hide. The Americans learned to compensate, adjusting their depth charge settings to catch the echoes that curved beneath. This precision terrified Japanese submariners. Lieutenant Commander Tetsuo Okabe, captain of I-41, later described it in interrogation. "We thought we were safe under the layer. Always, before, no one could find us there. Then the Americans did. They knew the sea better than we did. The technology behind this mastery had multiplied. The QHB sonar, with its twin-beam transmitter, had been joined by the new QCE, capable of automatic echo ranging and real-time plotting. Destroyer escorts carried the Mark 14 depth charge projector, the Hedgehog, a forward-firing weapon that threw 24 small bombs ahead of the ship in a tight pattern. Unlike the old depth charges, which exploded by preset depth, the Hedgehog's bombs detonated only on contact. The silence of a miss was as informative as the roar of a hit. To the Americans, this meant feedback. Each engagement generated data. If no explosions followed, the target had evaded. If one or more detonated, the position could be fixed precisely. The war had become a laboratory in motion. Between January and June of 1944, Japanese submarine losses rose to catastrophic levels. 33 I-boats were destroyed, more than in any previous year. Each was hunted by sound. Each heard the same metallic rhythm before the end. Survivors described the pings as almost sentient, searching, patient. "They followed us," said Warrant Officer Mitsuo Sato, as if the sea itself had eyes. But the true innovation was not merely the machine, it was the mind behind it. The United States Navy had begun integrating sonar operators directly into tactical planning. Aboard destroyers, the sound shack became as important as the bridge. Commanders conferred with their sonar chiefs as equals. Every adjustment of bearing, every timing of a turn was guided by echo reports. The hunter and the instrument had merged. In contrast, the Imperial Japanese Navy never bridged the gap between science and command. Captains distrusted technicians, admirals distrusted theory. Even when captured documents revealed American advances, Tokyo dismissed them as exaggerations. When engineers proposed copying the Hedgehog in late 1944, the project was rejected too complicated, too foreign to Japanese tradition. By summer, that tradition was dying under the waves. In June, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese submarines attempted to intercept the American invasion fleet. Of 20 boats deployed, only 6 returned. The rest vanished, victims of destroyer screens that used sonar in coordination with radar and aircraft. The Americans had turned detection into choreography. For the Japanese, it was annihilation by mathematics. Each submarine lost was not just a vessel, but an idea, the idea that courage and stealth could overcome machinery. The sea no longer belonged to the unseen hunter, it belonged to the listener. At the end of one post-war analysis, an American officer wrote, "By 1944, we no longer fought submarines. We measured them." And beneath that cold statement lies the truth of the age. The Pacific had become a numerical ocean. and in numbers, Japan could not compete. By late 1944, silence, once the Teche, great refuge of submariners, had become their executioner. In the age of sonar, silence was no longer concealment, it was target acquisition. The ocean, once a cloak, had turned traitor. The Imperial Japanese Navy learned this lesson the hardest way possible, in the deep troughs east of the Marianas. There, in the final months before the fall of Saipan, the I-boat fleet, the pride of Japan's long-range undersea arm, found itself trapped between science and inevitability. Lieutenant Commander Haruto Kubo, captain of I-37, had been trained in the old doctrine, patience, stealth, and faith in the deep. His orders were to interdict American reinforcements crossing from Pearl Harbor to the western Pacific. He believed in his crew, his engines, and his luck. What he did not believe in was sonar. When I-37 slipped beneath the surface off the Caroline Islands on November 10, 1944, Kubo thought he was alone. He had no idea that the destroyer escort USS Lawrence C. Taylor was tracking him with a precision that defied imagination. The American sonar operator, Seaman First Class Earl Minter, heard the first faint echo at 1,800 yards, a double-beat return, characteristic of a submarine's cylindrical hull. The pattern was textbook. "Contact, bearing green 2 to 4, he reported. In the control room, Lieutenant Commander Robert Baldwin ordered a slow closing turn. The ship heeled gently to port, maintaining sonar lock as the distance closed. The pings came faster now, not in volume, but in rhythm, each return a heartbeat of geometry. Below, I-37 felt the first tremor of sound. The hydrophones recorded the pulses clearly. Kubo listened, calm at first, then wary. "Destroyer. Far range," he noted in the log. He ordered a descent to 250 feet, silent running, engines off, gliding on residual power. For 20 minutes, the sea seemed quiet. Then the sound returned, louder, perfectly centered. "It is impossible," Kubo muttered. "They cannot see us." The first pattern of depth charges fell, 6 explosions, then 8, each one closer. The hull rang like a gong, the lights flickered out. Men screamed as water burst from a cracked joint. The boat pitched downward, then stabilized. On the surface, Baldwin ordered the Hedgehog fired. 24 projectiles arced into the air and plunged ahead of the ship, sinking silently. Seconds passed. Then 1, 2, 3 white blossoms erupted from the sea. The sonar screen flared with echoes. I-37 never resurfaced. The Americans recorded a confirmed kill at coordinates 13 degrees north, 146 degrees east. Another submarine erased by mathematics and sound. In Tokyo, the 6th Fleet received the loss report in December. No wreckage was ever found. The staff officer who read it simply wrote, "Lost due to enemy sound detection." It was a bureaucratic phrase for extinction. By then, the Imperial Navy's submarine force was collapsing faster than its shipyards could replace it. Between August and December 1944, 34 boats vanished. The survivors began to call themselves the Ghost Fleet. American tactics had evolved into a deadly ritual. Once a sonar contact was gained, one destroyer held it, while another maneuvered to attack. The first ship's sonar beam locked the target, the second delivered the strike. If contact was lost, the two ships exchanged bearings by radio, triangulating the submarine's probable position within minutes. It was science made choreography a duet of steel and precision. To the submariners below, it was madness. The pinging grew in their dreams. Veteran captains described the sound as metal rain, the hammer of the gods, or simply the voice. They began to dread it more than depth charges themselves, for it meant the destroyers were not guessing anymore. The Americans had even begun to weaponize silence. After an attack, destroyers would shut off their engines and drift, waiting for the submarine to move. The moment it did, even slightly sonar would pick up the new echo. The result was catastrophic. Many Japanese captains ordered their crews to remain motionless for hours, oxygen dwindling, carbon dioxide thickening, until men fainted at their posts. The ocean was no longer neutral. It betrayed every vibration, every heartbeat. At Pearl Harbor, the anti-submarine warfare section compiled weekly summaries of contacts and sinkings. The reports were clinical, full of equations and ranges, but between the lines ran a quiet astonishment. The U.S. Navy had achieved total acoustic dominance. Every month, fewer submarines appeared on the map. Every month, fewer escaped. By January 1945, the once feared I-boat fleet had become irrelevant. The great undersea raiders that had prowled the Indian Ocean in 1942 now lay in silence on the seabed monuments to an outdated faith. For Japan, the defeat was not only material but philosophical. They had entered the war believing that courage, training, and willpower could balance industry. But no amount of spirit could defeat a machine that could hear you breathe. In one of his last wartime letters, an anonymous Japanese submariner wrote to his wife from Kure Naval Base. "The Americans have learned to hear the sea. We hide, but the water tells them where we are. The ocean itself has changed sides." It was not an exaggeration. By the winter of 1944, the Pacific no longer belonged to sailors. It belonged to sound. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War beneath the waves had become a one-sided execution. The Imperial Japanese Navy still launched submarines, but they sailed into an ocean that had turned into an enormous listening chamber. The Americans no longer searched for them. They simply waited for the echoes. Every major sea lane, from Okinawa to Leyte, from the Marianas to the South China Sea, was now covered by overlapping sonar patrols. Destroyer escorts moved in grids, each spaced by calculated intervals so that no submarine could slip between their cones of detection. The strategy was called continuous coverage, devised by Commander Charles Hutchins of the Pacific Fleet's anti-submarine warfare section. Its principle was brutally elegant. If the ocean could be divided into sound cells, then a submarine could never hide. The technology that made it possible was the culmination of 3 years of relentless refinement. The new QGA sonar, tested aboard the destroyer USS Cassin Young, could sweep through a wider frequency band, identifying even faint echoes that earlier systems had dismissed as wails or thermoclines. Paired with radar and air patrols, it turned every task force into a floating sensor array. For the men aboard American ships, it was not triumph, but routine. Sonar operators spoke in the monotone of professionals. Contact, bearing 210, range 800 yards. The captain would nod, plot the approach, and order the first pattern. Moments later, the sea erupted in the practiced cadence of depth, charges not fury, but procedure. To the Japanese trapped below, there was nothing procedural about it. Survivors of the I-44, sunk off Luzon in May 1945, told their interrogators what it was like. The metallic ringing of the pings, the waiting, the shudder as the first explosions shook the hull. "It was like the world itself was tearing apart," recalled Petty Officer Akira Nagamura. "We could hear our own boat screaming." American commanders understood what they were doing and what it meant. Destroyer captains joked grimly about underwater turkey shoots, but privately many admitted unease. Lieutenant Commander James Mann of the USS Samuel S. Miles wrote in his log, "We are not fighting men anymore. We are hunting ghosts that can drown." The collapse of the Japanese submarine arm had been total. Of the more than 160 operational I-boats that Japan had launched during the war, barely a dozen remained by the time Okinawa fell in April 1945. Most never even reached their patrol zones. The Sixth Fleet's reports to Tokyo had grown so vague that by summer they were little more than lists of silence. American intelligence analysts at Pearl Harbor called it acoustic attrition. The phrase captured the essence of this new kind of war, not a duel between opponents, but a process of systematic erasure. Every frequency, every depth, every thermal layer had been charted, measured, and mastered. What had once been a battle of stealth had become a contest of endurance, and endurance was something Japan no longer possessed. The few remaining Japanese submarines were turned into supply vessels, trying desperately to carry food and weapons to isolated island garrisons. They moved at night, at shallow depth, hugging coastlines, but even there the pings followed. In July, the I-351, one of Japan's largest transport submarines, was caught while attempting to reach Singapore. A radar-equipped Catalina flying boat spotted her wake, forced her to dive, and guided the destroyer USS Conklin onto the contact. The hedgehog pattern hit on the first pass. There were no survivors. In Tokyo, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, once the hero of later Gulf, reviewed the final submarine reports and issued a quiet directive: cease offensive patrols. Preserve remaining crews for homeland defense. But even the home waters were no longer safe. By then, American destroyers were operating off the very coast of Honshu, sweeping the Bungo and Key Straits, where it had all begun 3 years earlier. The circle was complete. In those final months, the sound of sonar became part of Japanese coastal life. Fishermen in the inland sea reported hearing strange metallic beats echoing through their hulls at night. They called it aim no oto, the sound of rain. They did not know it was the rhythm of defeat. When the war ended in August 1945, fewer than 10 operational submarines remained in Japanese hands. Many were scuttled in harbors to prevent capture. The ocean floor around Japan became a graveyard of steel, each wreck still wrapped in the silence that once promised protection. In post-war interrogations, Rear Admiral Noboru Ishizaki, former commander of the Sixth Fleet, spoke with bitter clarity. "We built our submarines to dive deep and fight bravely. The Americans built their destroyers to listen, and in the end, the listener always wins." It was the final truth of the sonar war that technology, once perfected, had erased the human contest entirely. There were no more duels, no more hunts, no more escapes. Only echoes without mercy, and the silence that followed them. When the war finally ended in August of 1945, the Pacific lay quiet for the first time in years, but it was not the same ocean. The old sea, where a submarine could vanish into black water and become legend, was gone. In its place was a new kind of ocean, an instrument, mapped and measured, its depths no longer mysterious. The Americans had taught the sea to hear. In the months after Japan's surrender, Allied technical missions fanned out across the defeated empire. Their orders were to locate and evaluate all surviving Japanese submarines, equipment, and research facilities. What they found told a story of desperation and disbelief. At Kure Naval Arsenal, investigators from the U.S. Naval Technical Mission to Japan found stacks of unfinished sonar sets, crude imitations of the American QHB, with vacuum tubes scavenged from radio receivers. The Japanese had called their system the Type 93 Model 2, but it was only capable of detecting large ships at shallow depths. It could not range, could not plot, could not hold a contact. Engineers admitted that their understanding of underwater acoustics lagged by at least 5 years. In one of the captured reports, a Japanese researcher wrote, "The Americans can hear the sea itself." To him, it was poetry. To the Americans, it was fact. The comparison was stark. The United States Navy entered the war with sonar that could barely detect a submerged submarine at 1,000 yards. It ended the war with systems that could locate one at more than 5,000 and track it through thermoclines and countercurrents. The Japanese, by contrast, had never advanced beyond basic echo detection. They had no trained sonar schools, no dedicated research centers, and no unified doctrine. The gulf between the two navies was not simply technological, it was philosophical. The Americans treated the ocean as a problem to be solved. The Japanese treated it as an element to be endured. That difference, the scientific versus the spiritual, had defined their fates. In September 1945, Commander Ralph Potter, who had led the acoustic arithmetic group at Pearl Harbor, visited the wreckage of the inland sea bases. He stood on the pier at Kure, listening to the faint slap of water against ruined hulls. "They never believed sound could be an enemy," he said to his interpreter. "That's why it killed them. The U.S. Navy, however, understood that what had been achieved in war could not be unlearned in peace. Even before the last Japanese submarines were scrapped, American scientists at Woods Hole, Harvard, and the newly established Office of Naval Research were turning wartime sonar into peacetime oceanography. Hydrophones, once used to track submarines, were now used to map the seafloor and measure whale songs. The Pacific that had destroyed the I-boats was becoming the world's greatest laboratory, but beneath the surface of triumph lay unease. Men who had served as sonar operators during the war described dreams in which they still heard the pings, endless, mechanical, echoing through silence. Lieutenant William Carney, who had hunted submarines aboard the destroyer USS Hole, later wrote, "We were taught to listen for life, and every time we heard it, we ended it." For the Japanese, the war's acoustic memory was darker still. Survivors of the submarine arm gathered in Tokyo in 1950, forming an association called Kai no Koei, the voice of the sea. They published their wartime logs and personal recollections, but many could not bring themselves to describe the last moments before the end. "The sound was everywhere," one wrote. "It came through the hull, through our bones. When it stopped, we knew we were dead." The captured Japanese documents from 1945 showed that only a handful of officers had even understood what sonar truly was. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Masao Hoshina, a scientist at the Yokosuka Naval Technical Research Institute. In his final report, he wrote a single sentence that post-war historians have often quoted: "We thought we fought men. We were wrong. We fought mathematics." It was mathematics, and the industrial power behind it, that had turned sound into a weapon. Every ping, every plotted echo, every calibrated depth charge was part of a vast mechanical ecosystem that no individual courage could resist. The Americans did not win because their sailors were braver, but because their civilization had learned to organize knowledge faster than its enemies could imagine it. By the time peace came, sonar had reshaped not only warfare, but perception itself. The idea that the ocean was unknowable had died. The war had proven that even the deepest trenches could be charted, that silence itself could speak if you had the tools to listen. In that sense, the defeat of the Japanese submarine fleet was more than a military event. It was the end of an age, the last time men could disappear into the sea and believe they were beyond reach. When the sun rose over the inland sea in September 1945, fishermen reported hearing the faint metallic echoes still rolling through the water. They called it the ghosts of the submarines. Scientists later explained it as the lingering reverberation of collapsing wrecks and sonar buoys still active offshore. But for those who had lived through it, the meaning was clear. The sea remembered, and it was still listening. In the quiet years that followed 1945, the Pacific became a mirror again, calm, radiant, seemingly indifferent to what had happened beneath its surface. But for those who understood what the war had changed, it was not the same ocean at all. The sonar war had rewritten humanity's relationship with the sea. What had once been mystery had become geometry. What had once been faith in silence had turned into faith in data. The scientists and sailors who had mastered the wartime acoustics did not disband when peace came. Instead, they carried their expertise into new laboratories, new projects, and new fears. The Cold War was beginning, and once again, nations turned to the sea to hide and to listen. In 1949, the United States Navy launched Project Jezebel, the first attempt to build a permanent undersea listening network across the Atlantic and Pacific. Using technology descended directly from the destroyers that had hunted Japanese submarines, engineers laid miles of hydrophone cables on the ocean floor. They called it the Sound Surveillance System, SOSUS. Where once sonar had hunted individual boats, now it listened for the pulse of entire fleets. The logic was the same as that which had destroyed the Imperial Japanese submarine arm. Whoever could hear first lived longest. The American scientists who designed SOSUS cited the war's Pacific records as their proof. Every graph, every acoustic trace from Bungo Strait to the Marianas had shown the same truth, that in the sea, sound ruled everything. At the same time, Japanese scientists, stripped of their navy and forbidden to build weapons, turned the ruins of their sonar programs toward peaceful research. At the University of Tokyo, Professor Masao Hoshina, once a lieutenant commander in the Yokosuka Naval Technical Research Institute, began a series of studies on underwater acoustics for fisheries and ocean mapping. His instruments were built from leftover military parts. When asked in an interview what had inspired him, he answered softly, "Defeat. We learned to listen because we had no choice." The irony was profound. The very technology that had annihilated Japan's submarines was now helping Japan feed its people. By 1955, Japanese research vessels equipped with echo sounders were charting fish migrations across the Pacific, their sonar pings echoing over the same graves where the I-boats had fallen. The ocean, once a battlefield, had become a laboratory of life. But the shadow of war still lingered. The American destroyermen who had fought the underwater campaign often found themselves haunted by sound. Veterans described hearing phantom pings at night, rhythmic and precise, like memories refusing to fade. Psychologists at the Veterans Administration even coined a term for it: sonic persistence. One report from 1947 described a former sonar operator who claimed he could still feel the vibrations in his bones whenever he stood near the sea. To historians, the sonar war became a case study in how technology overtakes doctrine. The Imperial Japanese Navy had possessed courage, discipline, and skilled crews, but it had entered the war thinking in 2 dimensions. The United States Navy had entered thinking in 3: surface, air, and the hidden acoustic realm below. That 3rd dimension, unseen but measurable, had decided the outcome. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, extended to naval operations, found that between 1943 and 1945, American anti-submarine forces achieved a confirmed kill rate exceeding 60% once sonar contact was made. The report concluded bluntly, the development of sonar and its tactical application constituted the single most decisive factor in the destruction of the Imperial Japanese submarine fleet. It was a triumph of method over myth. For centuries, sailors had feared the ocean as a place of mystery and chance. The war had proved it was a place of physics. In 1962, during a joint U.S. Japanese Naval Symposium in Yokosuka, Admiral Arleigh Burke, then Chief of Naval Operations, met with retired Japanese officers who had once commanded submarines. One of them, Captain Yoshiharu Kuroda, bowed deeply and said, "We used to believe the deep protected us, but the Americans taught us that the deep can betray." Burke's reply was quiet. "The deep only tells the truth. We just learned how to listen." By then, the listening had never truly stopped. Every ocean basin now hummed with hydrophones, sonobuoys, and recording stations. The ghost of wartime sonar lived on in every submarine chase of the Cold War, every whale study, every scientific expedition that used sound to map the unseen. What began as a wartime necessity had become a permanent condition of civilization. Humanity had given the ocean ears, and in doing so, had surrendered its last refuge of secrecy. At the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, a bronze plaque was installed in 1965 to honor the sonar operators of the Pacific War. It bears no names, only a phrase taken from the logbook of an anonymous destroyer escort. "We hunted by sound, and sound answered." It is both epitaph and prophecy, a reminder that in the age of machines, silence itself can be conquered. The Japanese submariners had once called the ocean the Great Listener, believing it to be alive. Perhaps, in the end, they were right. For long after, the warships rusted and the flags came down, the echoes remained endless, patient, eternal. The sea still hears, and it never forgets.